Hey everyone, welcome back to Transform Your Workplace. I'm your host, Brandon Laws, and I'm so happy to have you here today. Today's episode is packed with actionable insights for anyone looking to grow their leadership muscle without needing the fancy title to back it up. Joining me today is Matt Norman, the author of Lead with Influence, a proven process to lead without authority. In today's conversation, we're diving into practical strategies for influencing others, even if you don't have direct power or control. Matt shares relatable stories like how being curious and vulnerable can deepen trust, and we unpack how simple language shifts can turn opposition into collaboration. You'll hear ideas about balancing urgent tasks with deep work, staying present under pressure, and why it's critical to go upstream to solve the root problems. Before we get into the conversation, I wanted to give a big shout out and thank you to Xenium HR, the sponsor of Transform Your Workplace. If you're looking to grow as a leader, Xenium has incredible leadership and development programs coming in 2025, especially for supervisors who want to sharpen their skills. So don't miss out. Check them out at xeniumhr.com. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite app so you don't miss an episode. And let's keep the conversation going. I want you to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode and any other topics that you want to hear about. All right, let's jump into the conversation with Matt Norman. Matt, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much, Brandon. Excited to be here.
We're going to talk about your book. It's called Lead with Influence, a proven process to lead without authority. So you start out the book talking about Clara, who a lot of people could relate to. She's juggling multiple responsibilities as a parent and a job. Doesn't have a ton of authority, though. How do you suggest people like Clara, who are trying to balance their lives while also trying to influence decision makers and probably feeling a little overwhelmed in the process?
It's hard. I remember a couple months ago trying to influence somebody on a different team within our organization, and I felt rushed. I felt frustrated in this email correspondence back and forth because we had different priorities and different personalities, and I had no authority over this person. She sits in another part of the country, in another part of the organization, and she was not aligned with the things that I wanted to have happen. And so I would write her this email, why are you doing it this way? Can you please give me your process for this? Would you be willing to do this? All these, kind of pleading comments in my email to this person again, who I can't tell her, I can't make her do anything. And she would come back and she would respond with, saying, well, our policy is, the procedure on my team is, our priorities are, and I'm thinking, oh, that's so frustrating. And meanwhile, I have 100 emails that I'm trying to do and all of these various people that I'm trying to influence. And this is just this piece of sand inside the oyster, is just like causing agitation. But I think a lot of us can relate to this feeling of just constantly trying to have these influence relationships with people, or maybe call it politics across our organization, people that have competing priorities. We don't have authority over them. We can't make them do anything. We have lots of other things that are clouding our thoughts. And so it's just hard.
Influence, to me, it seems like an art and a science, and there's a psychology behind it, right? How do we grow that muscle, the psychology of influence, so we can start to get buy-in and influence others even when we don't have the title or the authority to do so?
I love that you called it a muscle and that we can grow it, because I do agree. Some people think we're born with it. So I remember going through my first sales course, learning how to sell, and feeling like this was this epiphany that there is a psychological process to moving somebody through the decision to make a commitment, overcoming their hesitations, causing them to change their way of thinking. But it's hard. Even to know that process doesn't mean that we can execute that process, because I know for me, I am fundamentally more introverted, and I have, over the course of my career, at times struggled with lacking confidence in certain interactions with certain maybe types of people. And so even if I know the psychological process to influence somebody, I don't always have the ability to implement it in the moment. And so for me, and for a lot of the people that I've coached and worked with, it's this constant growing the muscle, like you said, by practicing, knowing the steps I need to follow, and then just being intentional in all of my interactions, whether it's with my family, with my friends, or with my colleagues, my clients, to continuously try to flex and exercise that muscle.
Something that I thought a lot about is like early in my career when I didn't have the title, I would always want to be there for people as a resource. And sometimes that means fighting fires and handling urgent things that come your way. But that does sacrifice some of the like deep work that I can get into. And I love how your book references Cal Newport's work, deep work, several times throughout the book. I love that book. We need our own productivity. And sometimes that deep work allows us to then come back and influence other people through the work that we're doing. But how do we balance the urgent matters that come our way through other people, whereas we don't want to sacrifice our productivity either?
Yeah, it's so hard, isn't it? It feels great to be the hero, the rescuer, the doer, check things off our to-do list, not disappoint. I love how Cal Newport talks about the neuroscience around human beings not wanting to disappoint others, not wanting to be the person in the group that doesn't uphold their bargain or their part in the community to do their part. And so for us to not respond to an email or to not help someone out or to say no to somebody is really difficult. One of my other favorite leadership authors and speakers is Andy Stanley. Andy Stanley has a leadership podcast. And I remember hearing him say one time that the more he matures in leadership, the more he realizes that a key to effectiveness is learning how to say no and disappoint people. And I'm reminded of the kind of this story of two lifeguards watching people swimming at a beach on a river. And suddenly one of the lifeguards notices that someone is flailing in the water, screaming for help. And fortunately, this lifeguard has a number of flotation devices, and so throws a flotation device into this person and rescues them. But then more people start coming down the river, flailing, screaming for help. Now, fortunately, again, the lifeguard has a tall stack of flotation devices, just keeps throwing them in, and is feeling good about themselves because you're rescuing all these people. And until finally another lifeguard comes over and says, are you curious why so many people are falling in the river or not swimming? Should one of us run upstream? And that running upstream, I think, is the deep work, some of the deep work that Cal Newport talks about, which is how do I go figure out what the root causes of this are? What is the critical factor? What's the why behind the what? What questions should I be diving into more deeply? And I don't know what the exact answer is as far as when should you just throw the life preserver and when should you run upstream. But I think it has something to do with anxiety. I think there's a sense in us that when we're operating from a place of anxiety, meaning we don't want to disappoint them, I want to appear competent. I want to retain control. That when we operate from that place of anxiety, we tend to hold on, keep throwing the life preservers too long versus pausing and having the courage to run upstream.
That's so well said. Because if you think about your own work, sometimes we need to go look upstream just to see what's causing the downstream or urgent issues that are landing on our desk all the time. How do you make that mental shift? Because it does seem like you need some experiences, you need to be self-aware and be able to recognize that, you do need to go look upstream and solve some strategic issues that may be causing problems for you or creating urgent tasks.
I had a really interesting thing happen to me just a few days ago. I ended up getting into a conversation with somebody about the presidential election, and it immediately became oppositional. The other person said something that I just disagreed with completely. And my knee-jerk reaction was to argue with them in that moment. I wanted to combat the irrational statement that I thought that they made. And then I walked away. So I said to that person, well, why do you think how could that be true? And wouldn't you consider this point instead? And then they came back and had another argument, and it was not productive at all. I ended up in that situation withdrawing and just sort of getting quiet, which was not a productive. It was fine. It diffused the tension, but it didn't contribute to more trust and connection in the relationship because I was being avoidant by just withdrawing. And as I left that conversation, I thought, I wish I would have been in more of a posture of curiosity in this interaction. I wish I would have, instead of just knee jerking, oh, well, have you thought about this? And here's what I think. Instead, if I would have just approached that conversation with less anxiety and physiologically breathing and reminding myself what matters most, which is the relationship and not being right. And I think that would have allowed me to discern more effectively whether I should argue with this person, which was not the right course, or ask more questions and find out what's really going on here. And I think that applies also to what you're talking about, which is even why are we solving for this problem? What research do we need to do? I think it begins with our mental posture, even our physiological posture as we're going into work. Are we going in with a lot of anxiety, a lot of hurry, a lot of desire just to knock stuff down, get stuff out of our way, get things done? And I came home from work the other day and my wife asked me how my day was. I said, it was great. She asked, why? And I said, because I got a ton done. And she said, is that how you measure your day? And I thought, today it was. It was how many emails I got, how many things I checked off my to-do list. And when we have that posture, I think we tend to knock people down like their to-dos, rather than really connecting and being curious.
Yeah, that's very well said. And I think a lot of us can find ourselves in those situations where met with confrontation or resistance, and we could feel that physiological response like you were just talking about, like the heavy breathing, breakout in rashes, whatever it may be. Like sometimes we have a visceral reaction to whatever we're dealing with. How do we recognize that and make that shift? Is it as simple as asking questions? Is it being self-aware about how we're feeling in those moments so that next time we have it, we're well prepared? I mean, how do we make this shift? It seems hard.
Yeah. I don't know that we can simplify that to just one answer, but I think there are a few things that I found personally to work and also through coaching a lot of people in this. One is I recently made a commitment to a specific relationship that was important to me and that some tension had developed in the relationship. And I knew that I needed to change the pattern in that relationship. And so I approached that relationship with more intentionality, more thoughtfulness. I had named that relationship in my mind. I had said, when I'm with this person, if I want a different result, I need to be more intentional. So when I'm with that person now, alarms sort of go off in my mind to say, you said this was a relationship that you were prioritizing. You were going to be more intentional, so be ready. I don't know that we're that intentional about most of our relationships. We just sort of react to our relationships. I think that's one thing, is to name certain relationships, because I don't know that we can necessarily do this with everybody. I think it's something that we probably have to, realizing that as human beings, we're limited in our ability to be perfect with all interactions. I think we have to do that. And then second, there are, neuroscience has demonstrated, psychology has demonstrated too, that there are certain practices, certain exercises. For example, last week, my 3 kids and I, my wife was out of the house doing a workout. And so I had us all, you're going to think this is kind of nerdy, but this is the kind of stuff we do in our house. I had us set a timer on our phone for 1 minute. And I said, for 1 minute, let's all just pick a word that we want to focus on that gives us energy and peace. And any thoughts that come into our mind during that 1 minute, any distractions, let's practice accepting and releasing those thoughts and then refocusing on that word just for 1 minute. And so everybody picked their word and the timer started. It was total silence. And yet I think all of us had distractions and things like that. And it was just for 1 minute. And as a family, we were practicing the art of staying present in the moment rather than attending to all these other thoughts and to-dos that are in our minds. So doing exercises like that, neuroscience, psychology has demonstrated that things like that can really help us build the presence so that when we're in that challenging moment, we can maybe choose to run upstream, be curious rather than just being reactive.
Yeah, you talked about curiosity being a way to connect with people. You also talk about vulnerability in the book a lot. I'm a huge fan of being vulnerable. But to your point, I don't think you could do this with everybody. Like you're not going to be able to connect perfectly with everybody because some people are not willing to open up. What are some exercises that you could use to practice vulnerability with other people, to open up more, maybe have more trust in relationships?
I'm reflecting on a meeting that I was just in this afternoon where I was meeting with a CEO who the conversation started by him saying, I asked, so how you doing? And he said, I've been better. And I decided to, in that moment, this split second question entered my mind because I don't know this person very well. And this is only the second time I've ever met with him. I've probably spent a cumulative 45 minutes with this person in my life. And I thought, do I let that go or do I go deeper? And I decided, I said, you want to unpack that a little bit? And he said, yeah, our company's not doing well right now. We missed our sales projection by 20%. And so then I asked, what's contributed to that? And after continuing to ask him a few questions, he ultimately he said, I think I've contributed to that. Because when things were really going well a year ago, we were really excited about where this company was going. And so we started taking on debt. We started hiring some highly paid people. We entered into some lease agreements. We bought another company because we had all this cash. And I think now we're out over our skis. And I should have slowed things down. I should have realized that things were not always going to move this quickly. It's my fault. And I thought in that moment, both of us were doing something that helped us to practice vulnerability. I was peeling back the layers of the onion. I think too often in our society, we're just quick to take someone's surface answer and move on, or maybe minimize it. Oh, it's not going to be that bad. Oh, you're being too hard on yourself. I bet this will all work out. Or, oh gosh, yeah, I've had some hard times too. We say things that let the other person off the hook from vulnerability. And then he was doing something which was uncommon, which is to have the humility and the self-awareness to admit his own contribution to an issue, which I thought was really powerful. And then that caused me to want to reciprocate. So that was it just happened to me a couple of hours ago, but really cool example of just how two people can sort of do this dance, even if they've barely known each other and operating on a very professional level, how in this 30-minute meeting, we were able to achieve a very substantial amount of vulnerability.
And I think of those moments like that where you opened up and that was sort of accidental, right? That was not planned, but going forward, you'll probably have another meeting with this person and think of the relationship's probably tighter than it ever was. And so you might be able to build on that. And it takes like small little incremental actions, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the word deposits comes into my mind, relationship deposits. It's like we have these capital accounts in our relationships. And are we making these little deposits? And certainly some of those deposits happen by doing nice things for other people, being generous, showing appreciation, things like that are all other ways to be cultivating more trust. But I think it's rare in our work culture, in our political culture, in our social culture that we proactively foster that level of vulnerability.
Speaking of deposits, you have a chapter where you talk about small actions that can lead to a lasting positive impression with people. There's a lot of good ideas. Highlight a few of those that you like and that you use on a regular basis.
Yeah. So I just was doing a follow-up email to somebody that I had met with where I don't remember how I started writing the message. It was something like, one idea that I had coming out of this meeting for you was, and as I reread the way I wrote that, I thought, it sounds more like I'm telling the person what I think they should do rather than reminding the person what they said they wanted to do, which I think is a slight shift. It's a little thing, like you said. So I deleted that sentence and I reworded it to, you'd mentioned in our conversation. And so one idea might be, and it was that little shift. I love that phrase, you'd mentioned, because I think it signals a number of things. It signals that this was your idea,
and
right?
Listening.
Yeah, I was listening, exactly. And I remembered what you said. And what I'm about to say aligns to something that you said, right? So I love that little phrase. It's super simple. You'd mentioned. That's one. Another little phrase, I think I geek out on phrases. For example, I just sent an email to somebody and they responded, unfortunately, those dates aren't available.
It's just so negative.
The word unfortunately, it's such a letdown word, right? It's such a letdown word. And so many people use it. I recommend that everyone take out the word unfortunately from their lexicon, at least in professional communication, because all it does is it says, I'm about to let you down. Like you said, it's so negative. Another one is, does that make sense? So I was explaining something to somebody recently, and at the end of the explanation. I was really tempted. Harvard Business Review had a blog like 10 years ago that said that's one of the worst phrases to use in communication. Because what it signals is, like you said, does that make sense? Signals that I maybe think you're less intelligent than I am. It's also a close-ended question. It's a yes or no, binary question. And so that's one of them. So instead, using words and phrases like let's is one of my favorite words, is it to include in any explanation. So somebody said to me recently, your proposal is way too expensive. And so I said, it sounds like what we need to do is for both of us to find a way for this investment to work together. And those key words, like, it sounds like what we need to do together is find a way for this investment to work. Let's have a conversation about it. You see all those key words, both of us, let's, together, signal to the other person that my goal here is to invite you into a collaborative interaction. It's not to an oppositional dynamic.
Yeah, I love that because it's collaborative in nature. The we statements, the let's, love it, because what we're trying to do is build relationships and trust with one another. And there are, like, it's so funny. The small little words make the biggest difference too. And we don't even realize we're doing it half the time.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, there's all these little signals that we send. We, as human beings, our amygdala, as you know, is constantly scanning our environment, looking for any threat to our survival. I love how Parker Palmer talks about this. Parker Palmer, who's an expert in group dynamics and trust. And in his book, A Hidden Wholeness, Parker Palmer compares human beings to wild animals, and how he says that wild animals are always scanning their environment, looking for any threat to their survival. And if they hear somebody, a branch break, someone steps on it, somebody is approaching, talking too loud, wild animals will go into hiding. And human beings do the same thing. We don't necessarily break branches in our team meetings, but we do talk over people. We don't acknowledge something that somebody said. We stay off camera in a virtual meeting. We are multitasking rather than making eye contact with people. There's all these little things that we do that send people into hiding, that make them, like wild animals, go into self-protect mode. Because whether they consciously acknowledge this thought or not, they're thinking, I'm not sure this person really values me. I'm not sure that I have total psychological safety with this person. And so therefore, I'm going to keep my guard up a little bit more. And we find it's very difficult to invite people into a collaborative interaction if their guard is up.
One idea I loved from the book, and I'd never heard this before, you talk about palace building language. What is a palace builder? Maybe share that example. And then how do we use this to elevate our conversations with others, increase our influence and authority?
It comes from this parable that someone walks up to a construction site and sees three people working on the same activity. And they ask the first person, what are you working on? And that person says, oh, can't you see I'm laying bricks? They walk up to the second person who's doing the same thing as the first person and ask, what are you working on? That person says, I'm building a wall. And they approach the third person who's doing the same activity as the first two people and ask, what are you working on? And that person has a different answer. They say, we are building a palace. Three people all doing the same activity, but three different ways of thinking about and talking about their work. And I think it reveals that this reality that so often we're very myopically focused on the bricks that we're laying. Our team is laying these bricks. We need to get these deliverables out the door. We need to write this proposal. We need to negotiate this deal. We need to, whatever it is. Those are the bricks. Now, those bricks may ladder up to something that's a little bit more of a, group effort, like a wall. But the palace is often something that I love the language of the third bricklayer. It says, we're building this palace. It implies vision, first of all, right? What are we going towards? But it also implies that there are a number of stakeholders. That a palace, bricks are typically laid just by masonry professionals, right? But palaces are built by plumbers, HVAC contractors, architects, all these different people with various contributions. And by having that inclusive understanding and that vision, it applies to, Gallup has research employee engagement. They find that one of the top drivers of employee engagement is that people see that their work connects to the big picture. A lot of us know that intuitively, at least. And it also reminds us that the more we talk big picture, it's like Simon Sinek's famous TED Talk, How Great Leaders Inspire Action. They start with why, talking about how Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other famous leaders throughout history have started with why, sort of like the famous example of when President John F. Kennedy he set the bold goal to put somebody on the moon by the end of the 1960s. Of course, many of us know the story of when he visited a NASA facility and asked somebody at that facility what their job was. And they said, Mr. President, my job is to put a man on the moon. They were actually a janitor. It's this idea that we're constantly elevating and talking more in terms. So one of the ways that we coach to that is to use words like so that, or phrases like so that. So if I say, for example, Brandon, let's work on the editing of this podcast so that we're both able to expand the reach of this audience and be able to impact more people. So the editing of the podcast is the bricks, but the so that is expanding the reach and impacting more people. And often by using cueing language or prompting language like that, word stems like so that, we can leverage the Gallup research to get people more engaged in our ideas.
I love that illustration because it just clearly states that as leaders, we need to be communicating our why often and over again in one-on-one meetings, in team meetings, through our employer branding, whatever it takes, so that people know that the littlest task that they're doing is contributing to the greater mission, the purpose of the organization. And that's tough. I mean, like, I'm in marketing, right? And you think like you say your message once and somebody's going to resonate with it. That's absolutely not true whatsoever. You need to repeat it over and over again, and eventually it might stick. And if you're lucky enough, you get other people saying it back, and, with their colleagues or friends, and you could build a bigger and better team that way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so well said. And yeah, you do have such visibility in your role in marketing. And we know we're competing with so many distractions and so many messages. And I mean, even from personal experience, I forget my own personal why. I go on a walk every morning with my dog for 20 minutes, and I literally have certain things that I say out loud that remind me of what matters most to me, my priorities in life. And it's because, and I know if I skip a couple days walking my dog, I find myself starting to slowly drift in my actions, my choices, my thoughts away from the things that matter most. So we all need a constant reminder. I couldn't agree with you more.
As leaders, how do we get better? Or I guess as any contributor level person, whether you're a leader or contributor, how do we ask the right questions instead of jumping right to solutions? Because I think many of us, we hear a problem, we want to jump right into it instead of asking more clarifying questions like you described earlier, being curious and seeking to really understand before jumping right in and trying to solve a problem.
It's really hard. It's so hard when we're good at solving a problem or good at fixing, and we know we can, and especially if we have the answer in our mind, right? We know from what the person said, I know what this person should do. So I think a few things. One is setup. I talk about in the book how setup is important, inviting people into a conversation that's going to be more about questioning than telling. And so in the book, you remember we talk about the positioning statement and the agenda statement as just real quick ways to include in an email invite or at the beginning of a conversation to frame the conversation that this is going to be less about solutioning, or at least suggesting that it's less about solutioning, and get the other person's permission to ask them some questions. Because sometimes people, what they want is they just maybe want an answer. They think they want just the solution. And so I think getting permission and framing the conversation, using a quick statement like we talk about in the book, can be really helpful. So I think that's one thing, is setting it up well. The second thing, I just would reiterate, we talked before about managing our own anxiety. I think we have to acknowledge that there needs to be a metacognition that's happening when we're in conversations where we need to be talking to ourselves, coaching ourselves and saying, okay, this person is presenting a problem, and I am probably going to feel very tempted to just react and solve that problem, right? I love Peter Block's book, Flawless Consulting, where he talks about the presenting problem that can, when you're in the role of a consultant, you hear the presenting problem almost all the time. And a great consultant never responds to the presenting problem. And that requires some metacognition, again, some self-talk to say, here comes the presenting problem. You're kind of like the narrator of your own conversation. And to be able to say, okay, we need to go to the underlying, and I need to ask more questions. And then thirdly is to be an effective questioner, to your point. And in the book, we talk about effective questioning techniques, but there's some real psychology around how to ask generative questions, questions that cause people to explain more of the context or the why behind the what, maybe some of their motivations. We also talk in the book about how human beings have both logical and emotional drivers to their thinking. And if we're only hearing one of those two aspects, we're not really getting a full perspective. So I think those three things, getting a permission to set the conversation up in a way that's more collaborative, more of asking questions. Second, to self-talk and have that metacognition. And then third, be an effective questioner.
Another idea I love from the book that I think would gain a lot more alignment and probably influence over people is making sure that we're recapping on a regular basis through ongoing conversations that we're having. How many times should we be recapping, whether it's a meeting or where we're at in a process? You highlight a lot of ideas in this chapter.
It's amazing the psychological power of recapping, isn't it? Just saying to somebody,
Seems so simple.
It seems so simple. Just to
but nobody does it.
Yeah, nobody does it. Yeah, it's how often should we do it? Well, there's certainly an opportunity to recap at the end of a conversation. Number one. Number two, post-conversation. I just met with someone a couple of days ago, and we had a great conversation, but it went a lot of different directions. And my temptation in the follow-up email that I sent was just to focus on my recommendation. But I realized that this person in the last conversation, probably because we went so many different directions over the course of about an hour conversation, probably lost some of the narrative in their own mind and needed to be regrounded in what we talked about. Also, I knew that they were needing to influence other people and they were going to need their talking points clear in their own mind. And so by recapping in a follow-up email, I not only regrounded the narrative, but I also provided them with these pithy talking points that as they're rationalizing or justifying to their stakeholders why we're having this, putting more investment into this conversation, they've got that. So there's certainly at the end of a conversation, post-conversation, in the next conversation. I had a meeting today where at the beginning of the conversation, I said, I remember from our last conversation, we talked about 4 things. Would it be appropriate for me to start out this meeting by just going through those 4 things that you talked about in our last meeting and then let you decide which of those 4 things, or if there's something else you'd want to talk about in this meeting? And he went, great. Yeah, please do that. And I think it was very helpful for him. So those are the opportunities. But then you also allude to the during that, certain intervals to just say, I heard you just say this a moment ago. Did I get that right? Can I play that back to you? Can be a really effective. I just was listening to a podcast on how to improve political discourse on university campuses. And brilliant, one of the things she teaches her students to improve political discourse is to just get better at the skill of recapping, especially when they disagree with somebody, because it makes sure that the person feels heard and that there's no incorrect assumptions that we're making.
Love that. How can celebrating our wins, both publicly and privately, help build a culture of influence and really help to form the team bond and psychological safety and all of these things that we're talking about around influence?
I was on a meeting earlier this week where the executive team said, we really want to build more of a culture of X. And they said, you made a suggestion to us about 6 months ago that we celebrate wins. And so we, in our town hall meetings now, have a professional development recognition moment where we recognize one person in the company at the whole town hall meeting. This is not a huge company, but in front of everybody, they say, we recognize so-and-so for intentionally applying some of the skills we've been working on in our company in professional development. And one of the other executives in this meeting, this was a virtual meeting I was on, said, oh yeah, was that Tyler that we recognized in the last meeting? And this other executive said, oh yeah, that was Tyler. And then another executive jumped in, oh yeah, I love how Tyler is doing this. And it went from talking abstractly about professional development and culture development to talking about Tyler and celebrating how Tyler is really making an effort, how other people are seeing that Tyler is growing and applying the areas of focus that the company is working on right now. So many people, so many executives, I think, dismiss culture development, people development, because they say, oh, it's flavor of the month, it's not going to stick, people forget it, all these things. And yet when we hear a story about Tyler and see the reaction from those executive team members, you start to realize that celebrating just those individual wins has incredible emotional momentum. And so it seems so simple, whether that's celebrating at a town hall meeting or just one-on-one with a Tyler, to be able to say, I've noticed that you are really trying to apply what we're working on right now.
How can we apply what we've talked about today, and your book has so much more than what we're able to cover? How do we apply these in our daily interactions to lead more effectively? I mean, I was thinking back to when you're talking about your dog, you walk the dog in the morning, you have clarity, you're thinking about your priorities. Is it as simple as that? Like just planning our day in a way we can thoughtfully think through some of these things and make sure that we're making a daily effort? Like, how simple is it?
I mean, I do think that helps. I love Atomic Habits, as most people have read, by James Clear, just talking about all the little changes that we, and the ways that the habit stacks that we can get into, and the ways of reminding ourselves to do the things that we want to be doing. I do think for me, walking the dog in the morning is part of my habit stack that gets me oriented in the right direction. Also, just deciding that we're going to be a learner. My wife and I have made a decision that one of the core purposes of our marriage and of our life is to help ourselves and others grow. We think that's one of the main purposes of life, is to grow as a human being. And so because I'm oriented that way, it's a little bit like James Clear talks about, the difference between people who try to quit smoking, who say that, oh, I'm just trying to stop smoking, versus the people that say I'm a non-smoker. How people who say their identity is based in the fact that they're a non-smoker increases substantially their likelihood of refusing a cigarette. I think the same is true if we say my identity is based on being a learner. My identity, it's the whole Carol Dweck growth mindset. That's who I am. And so when I have the choice of whether to listen to a podcast like yours or just listen to the radio and zone out, I'm a learner. I'm going to choose to listen to the podcast. And if I have a choice between taking notes on this podcast or just letting it go and not thinking anymore about it, I'm going to choose to write things down. And if I have a choice between sharing those notes with other people on my team or just keeping those notes to myself, I'm going to share them out with my team. So there's all these little micro decisions that we make every day that I think, like Clear talks about, are based on our identity. And so I think if we have the identity of being a learner, we're just going to keep saying yes to opportunities to apply these ideas.
Matt, good stuff. Your book is called Lead with Influence, a proven process to lead without authority. There's so much in this book that we didn't even come close to covering. A lot of great nuggets in there. I encourage people to go pick it up. Where can people learn more about you, find the book? Anything else you want to say before we part?
You can find the book at Amazon and other major booksellers. It's also available in audio with me reading it, which was fun. And you can learn more about me at mattnorman.com, on LinkedIn, and certainly go to dalecarnegie.com, where there's a lot of information available, not just about the book, but also we have a course called Lead with Influence, which is a great opportunity to get practical coaching on how to apply these ideas.
My guest today has been Matt Norman. Matt, thanks for coming on the podcast. Appreciate you.
You too, Brandon.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. The content on this show is strictly for general information and educational purposes only, so that you can go transform your workplace in a positive way. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the show are the guest's own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of either Xenium HR, the sponsor of the show, or me, the host, Brandon Laws. Additionally, Xenium HR or myself, Brandon Laws, doesn't endorse any guest, their business, or any organization they represent, so discretion is advised. We encourage you to work with a trusted advisor to find a custom approach that fits your organization's needs. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode.